Hey guys, Saf here with another Raid Shadow Legends video. It is a busy day today. We have got the brand new patch live in the game, and I wanted to bring you a video discussing two major changes to champions, legendary champions in the game. One of them is a recent champion, and one of them is kind of an old school champion that actually is really good, but they have changed one of his flaws in his kit. So we're going to be looking at Black Knight, specifically his A3 multiplier. He is a Bannerlord, I believe. Where is he? Or is he a Sacred Order? I can never remember which faction this dude is in. Now, Black Knight pretty much is unique for his A1. He's got a 75% chance to place a Provoke debuff. Now, that's really, really strong for places like Head of Decay, places like Magma Dragon. Affinity was a bit of an issue for him in a lot of situations, especially in Hydra. But if you could get that Provoke going, it's great. And he is one of the few champions that has a 100% uptime on his increased defense. It's a 2-turn cooldown when you book it for it to place a 2-turn increased defense and a 2-turn continuous heal. But what was really problematic was the fact that he was essentially HP based, but his A3 was based on attack. And it was one of these abilities where the more health he lost, the harder it hit. You could get caught out in faction wars because he has this passive that gives unkillable, that he would just come in and one-shot your team because he was on 0% health. So they've changed this from an attack-based multiplier to now based on HP, which you think is very good. Well, the problem is the way they've changed it actually means that to some extent it's good, but in other aspects it's not. So let's take a quick look at the math there to figure out what's happened. The multiplier is changed like so. We've got the old one as attack times 1 plus 1 minus the difference of HP percentage times 10. So obviously in the number of HP percentage here, we'd either be feeding 100, 75, 50, 25, or 1%. The new multiplier is a flat 0.25 times HP. And then he has a damage multiplication effect, which increases that damage multiplier conclusion by the HP difference. But notice how the times 10 has gone. Now, what this basically means is the scaling of this ability is going to be off. If we were to take his base attack, multiply it with certain parameters to basically create an almost like a rough idea of a built Black Knight based on his base attack, we do this by just timesing his base attack with 3 and then adding 500 to account for flat stats from primary bonuses in other areas. We can give it a 1.5 times attack buff. We can't do that anymore, so that it gets counted in. And we're going to give him 20% books, and we're also going to give him 12% masteries. And then we're going to give him 250% crit damage. That will give his base damage at about 22,876 if he was at 100% HP. If we put that through a damage reduction of 69%, that's roughly sort of 2,500 defense without decreased defense. That would mean that his final damage would be 7,091. Now, if we scale this on the range of 100 to 1%, you can see that he gets a lot of extra damage the more HP he lost. Now, the problem was it used to hit like a wet noodle at the start. You wouldn't index into attack like that because you lose all the value of him being tanky and being that kind of, the A1 is based on HP, so you never really could get this damage to work. So it makes sense they change it to HP based. So this new multiplier, instead of it being a 22,876 base, we now are at 88,682 base, because again, we take his base HP of 22,000, which is extremely high, times 3, and we add 8,000 instead because base HP as a stat is obviously a bit bigger as a number, so that accounts for the helmet, or if we're using rings. We then times it by books, we times it by 250% crit damage, and then by 12% masteries, but not any buff, it's HP based. We can then pass that through exactly the same defense reduction percentage, so we get 27,491 base damage at 100%. So you can see, at base now, at 100%, he's actually doing 288% more damage than before, so it's a big buff at 100%. However, you lose the potential of a 1% nuker. That kind of Leoria style thing where the more damage you lose, the more health you lose, the more damage you gain. You've kind of lost that a little bit. It still grows. It's still, we're going from 27,000 to 54,000. It's doubling up at 1%, but it's not growing as dramatically. So we're getting a big buff at sort of 75% up, and then it's a nerf at 50% down. Now that's assuming you would index into attack in any form or shape or manner. So overall, this is a good change, but that's something to keep in mind, that the actual scaling is slightly different. You actually lose out a little bit now in terms of the sort of scaling. If you want to build like a max attack, 1% unkillable Black Knight that's just going to one-shot the enemy team, that's lost its potency by about 30% damage. That is a nerf for that strategy. But overall, I think it's okay. So let's take a look at the other champion that they've changed, Fortus. Now this is a new Void Legendary. It was just the guaranteed Void Legendary, and we didn't really have much more information other than we're going to fix the A3. So his kit in basic kind of a TLDR fashion, he's all about fear. He has this secret ability that can't unlock unless you place a fear. The good thing is it only has to be on fear placement, so at 40% chance, this kind of unlocks almost instantly, so it's not too much of an issue. It just means you can't open with it like Sky Piercer now. You have to have a fear out there first. On this A1, he has a chance of placing fear, and he has a chance of basically critically hitting on that A1 if there's a fear out there, so you don't have to run crit rate. On the A2, he places fear. The only thing is, you need accuracy unless there's a fear already out there. And to be honest, it's kind of weird that he's got a single target fear, which you can then like sort of place true fear. I'm not really sure how that's meant to work. Essentially, this forces you to have a secondary fear option, someone like a Mashaled alongside him. He's got a funky passive, which is kind of designed to really like allow him to go second in the arena where, you know, someone hits him and then he's going to sort of cleanse all the buffs off himself, cleanse all the debuffs, do all these things. You pay a lot of, you have a big hefty penalty basically here. It's too much loss to make this viable. It's not 100% chance to place fear. It should be. And then he sleeps himself and you can't even get rid of, like, you can cleanse that sleep, but you can't stop it. So I'm not too sure this passive is any use, but it's nice to have 15% more chance to proc fear. But what he was all about, and the idea that everyone was sitting here saying, right, okay, you place a fear, it's a bit like Mortu Macabre, but you're kind of like afraid or terrified to attack him because once he unlocks that peril, you're in trouble. Well, that was kind of like the concept when you read this. AoE attack, ignoring 30% of the target's defense if they're under fear, always critical if they're under fear, and then for every fear placed on an enemy, 10% more damage with 30% bucks, and he's defense based. So we're sitting there thinking, wow, this is going to be like the best, you know, he's void, he's legendary, it's going to be the best defense based nuker in the game. Well, the problem is the original multiplier was just dumb. It was bad. And we're going to look at that math now. And now they've come forward and they've changed it. Or we knew that they were going to increase the damage. And the change they have done is lazy coding. And we're going to look at that now. So the way that the old multiplier was working, you would take 0.1 times the fear quantity. So how many fears you placed. Now, originally, I didn't think this crossed over rounds. But since then, I think Nubkex has tested it out. And he was finding success with a fear count, almost like the count of how many fears have been placed on an enemy, was transferring across rounds, which actually is very important because that means it is potentially stronger the further into, say, a Doom Tower wave you get. He could become a really strong Doom Tower nuker in that sense. However, it was a 0.1 times the fear counter, and then it times it by 3.5. So that basically meant you started off with a 0.35 times defense multiplier, which is obviously really, really small. And that's why his damage didn't really make any sense, because you had to place like 10 to 15 fears to get into sort of what an average defense-based damage dealer would deal. And then obviously if you got to 30, 40 based fears, it would start really growing. But the problem here was, if you want to use it in arena, which is kind of where his main focus is, considering that most bosses fear is not viable, it doesn't work, it's blocked, you put 4 fears out there, he does no damage. So that was immediately, for a brand new Void Legendary, a problem. Well, the change they have done is still a problem for me. It's not correct. Instead of it multiplying by 3.5, they've now changed it to add by 3.5. So it goes 0.1 times the fear count plus 3.5. So you start at 3.5 and every fear gives you 0.1 towards your multiplier. Now you might be thinking there saying, oh, well, isn't that 10% more damage? No. It's not. It's significantly less. The skill description says each fear increases damage by 10%. That is the same way of saying this book has got 10% bonus damage from books. That's the same kind of concept. So if we take his base defense of 1387 and we take his base multiplier of 3.5, we can see the old way it was working, the bad way. It would start at 0.35 and up to 6 fears we would be at 2.1 multiplier, and that would be around about 2,913 damage if we have it as simple as base defense times multiplier. Now the new multiplier is going to start at 3.6 and it will go to 4.1. So that is a 2 multiplier increase. So that's pretty good. You know, we go from sort of 485 to 4,993 base damage, 5,687 scaled from 3,000. So it's a big improvement. But you can see each additional fear that I'm doing here is not giving me 10% more damage. It's giving me like 2%, 2 to 3% more damage. Every fear I place is meant to increase my skill by 10%. It's doing 2%. That's not good. That's bad coding. It's a lazy solution to this problem. And it's not like we don't have 100 other champions in this game that have a multiplication effect coded like this. We just talked about Black Knight and the way that they've coded him. That's how they should be coding this guy. Exactly the same model where you have a base multiplier and then a counter on a separate effect that multiplies the damage incrementally. If we did that, then we would have the way it should be, which is this third option here. We would start off at a standard 3.5 multiplier. That would remain the same. The multiplier would still be 3.5, but every single fear would increase the final damage by 10%. Now, it doesn't quite work out as 10% linearly here because obviously it's multiplicative in the way that it would work. However, you can see the difference here is we start at 5,340 for one fear. You need a fear to unlock the ability anyway, so there's never a scenario where you run with just 3.5 times defense. You're always going to be at least one fear. The next one, 583, that's a 9% increase. 6,300, the next one. So at 6, we should be seeing 7,767 base, which is a 6.7% increase from 5 fears. So it does kind of slow down a little bit. But you can see that's about 27% less damage based on the way that they've done it now. The way they have fixed it is 27% weaker than the way that the skill description explains it to be. The way that book multipliers work, it goes final damage times 1 point however many books. If it's 10%, it's 1.1. 1.2 for 20%, etc. Now, if this becomes too strong, then fine, you just adjust the multiplier, either that you start lower and therefore you need more fears, or you don't increase each damage by 10%, you do it by 5%. But the way that it is described is not the way that it is coded, and that is, in my opinion, misleading and bad. So does this actual change, however, make him viable now? Well, let's look at another champion in the same faction that actually has a similar effect to Fortus, and that is Solus, the number 1 defense-based damage dealer. So we can see Reign of Terror attacks all enemies, does a bunch of different things like increases debuffs, but the key thing to read here, damage increases by 10% for each debuff on the target. That is exactly the same way as saying damage increases for 10% every time I place a fear. It's the same kind of explanation. The way that they have coded Reign of Terror is exactly how I'm suggesting it should have been coded, where the damage multiplier carries through. He's 4.9 on this ability. 4.9. The damage multiplier carries through. And then they multiply the final damage by 0.1, which is 10%, times the number of debuffs that is on the target. So what I'm failing to understand in this situation is how we have managed to first implement it poorly. Okay, that can happen. You can think, oh, it's too strong. We didn't test it properly. But then when you go to fix it, you haven't actually fixed it in line with the way that other abilities that do exactly the same concept work, either through the fear that it's going to be too strong, or that you just didn't have time, maybe. I mean, it's basically a symbol change from a multiplication to a plus. Now, in terms of the damage output, well, we see Fortus has got 1,387 base defense. Solus has got 1,421, so he's got a higher base defense, but a lower base crit damage. So you're losing 13% crit damage, you're going up high there. He gains it based on debuffs on the target, so it's not a consistent counter, where obviously fear is easier to get a bonus multiplier. So we should see that in order for this to become a parity scenario, we're going to need to get enough fears to be at a 4.9 times multiplier, but with a little bit more oomph, because he's got 10% bonus damage. So even if there's one debuff out there, he's going to get 10% more damage. And that is 10% multiplied, not 10% extra on the multiplier, or 0.1 on the multiplier. It's not going to change it to 5 from 4.9. It's going to boost it by 10%. Well, let's compare Solus now with Fortus quickly in a very sort of rudimentary basic way. I've pulled in Solus's base defense of 1421, his A3 multiplier of 4.9, and I've also now included books because there is a disparity between the books. Obviously, the other thing we need to mention is Solus has a cooldown on that AoE. Fortus can reactivate his passive every time a fear is placed, right? So you can keep doing it. It has no cooldown. However, let's just map these numbers out. So if we did a 1 to 6 debuff range, we can see Solus starts at 8,425, going up to 12,254. And we can see the gain here is about, same kind of thing you're seeing on Fortus's side here. It does get less as you go higher, but it's still a consistent, it's 10%. It feels like you're gaining damage. Now, if we compare this with the way that it has been fixed for Fortus, you can see that Solus starts 69% stronger than Fortus at 1 fear. Now, if Fortus was at 6 fears versus 6 debuffs for Solus, it's 115% stronger for Solus's damage than Fortus. However, if we were to compare it with the correct way, there's no difference between the debuff counters because they're getting 10% linearly. One gets it through fear, one gets it through debuffs, but Solus overall is 21% stronger because when you do a like for like, the multiplier is 4.9 versus 3.5. The books alone are not enough to overcome the extra multiplier that Solus has with a higher base defense. However, if we do a more natural comparison, which is probably, say, take 2 debuffs from Solus with 4 fears out there for Fortus in an arena setting. Now, you could obviously get more debuffs to make Solus more effective, vice versa, but let's just compare that for example. Then you can see that versus the way they've implemented it, it's 70% weaker than Solus. Solus is 70% stronger the way they've implemented it if he has 2 debuffs on a target and Fortus has 4 fear counters. Whereas if it was the way that I'm suggesting it should have been fixed to, they would be on the same scale. They would be around about 4% for Solus, but that's not that problematic. It's much closer. And considering there's a good lot of AoE fears out there, the chances are you will get another round of it. Then Fortus becomes stronger than Solus. The way it has been coded is wrong. It is still broken. PLARIUM, please come back to this champion and fix it correctly so that it is more in line with the way that damage multipliers, where they boost the damage of a skill, is done. It needs to be in line with the way the books work and in line with the way that Solus works. There you go, guys. That is the end of the video. I hope that was interesting for you to understand the changes with both Black Knight and Fortus. I think the Black Knight change is pretty good, although it has kind of reduced or nerfed the strategy of like a high attack stealth Black Knight. I don't think many people were using that, so it's not so much of a problem. The nice thing is at least his A3 actually is relevant now as an AoE damage dealer in the HP secret rooms and other places. It's not going to hit like a wet noodle when you're trying to build him tanky. It's easier to build him. You're just going to lose out on that kind of damage scaling perspective. Fortus, we need another fix on him already. I feel like even though he's probably much better now, he's probably usable now, it's still not good considering you need the fear and it's not coded correctly. So if we can get that fixed to be coded correctly, Fortus is then a fantastic champion, even if you have to reduce this from 10% to 5%. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I will be doing a full patch notes breakdown of all the new champions and all their multipliers, looking at whether they are good damage dealers or not, going into that in more detail. If you haven't caught my reviews of the champions that were released over the last 2 days, that's where I go into detail about how to use the champions. The patch notes will pretty much focus on their damage capability. But until then, please subscribe to our channel if you want to see those videos come straight into your feed, and I will catch you in the next video.